All right, so today we're going to finish up the respiratory system and have an opportunity to kind of tie some of the things we've learned about with the respiratory system in with what we've learned about the circulatory system, because they do work hand in glove. So last time we ended talking about the mechanics of respiration, right? So what actually pulls air into the whole respiratory system and down into our lungs, into those tiny air sacs, the alveoli. And so you'll recall that the diaphragm, which is this dome-shaped muscle that separates your chest or thoracic cavity from your abdominal cavity, when it contracts, it moves downward. That creates negative pressure, suction in the chest cavity, which pulls air in. So inspiration or inhalation is the active phase of breathing, and exhalation, when the diaphragm relaxes, it just floats up and that pushes air back out of the system. So we're going to talk a little bit about lung volumes, and they're just kind of interesting. So these are ways that we measure how much air people are able to move. Yeah. Okay. A fly. Okay. So spirometry is what it's called when we have somebody kind of breathe in and out through a tube, and we can measure those volumes of air. In ye olden days, the way we did this was we would have a drum filled with air, and that was open on the bottom but sitting in a thing of water. And then as they would blow into it, it would float up and displace the water. Now it's usually digital. But pretty cool. All right, so the first thing is when you're sitting quietly and air is just moving in and out and in and out, and you're at rest and you're just doing normal quiet breathing, the volume of air that moves in and then out and then in and then out, like the waves of the ocean, is called the tidal volume. Okay, so this is what is moving in and out of your lungs right now as you're just sitting there quietly. And it's usually about 500 cc's, usually about half a liter most of the time. So tidal volume is this kind of normal, quiet breathing. There are some times, of course, when we need to move more air, right? So when our need for oxygen is higher or our need to get rid of carbon dioxide is higher, and we'll talk about why we need those things or need to get rid of them. So we need to be able to increase these volumes. So do a normal quiet inhalation, right? Not much to it. And then see how much air you could breathe in on top of that, right? So inhale and then fill your lungs up even more, right? So that's an amount of air that you can fill your lungs with, if you want, that you kind of hold in reserve. So this has a name that makes sense. It's called the inspiratory reserve volume. So if this is my normal tidal volume, in and out and in and out, I do a normal tidal volume, but then if I keep going and I fill my lungs as much as I can, that difference between a normal quiet inhalation and a maximum inhalation is the inspiratory reserve volume. And that's well over a liter, right? So you may have noticed your normal little inhale is pretty small, but then you can suck in a lot more air if you want to. Okay, so that's the inspiratory reserve volume. Now, of course, on the flip side, we can also exhale more air than we typically do. So if you do a normal tidal volume, quiet, relaxed exhalation, and then try to exhale more and empty your lungs out more thoroughly, you'll see we have quite a lot of expiratory reserve volume as well. So after a normal quiet exhalation, I can also push even more air out. So that's my expiratory reserve volume. So all of these three things together represent, if I empty my lungs as much as I possibly can and fill them up as much as I possibly can, or fill them up as much as possibly can and then empty them all the way, right? That whole amount of air that you can move maximally. So let's do it. Let's fill up your lungs as much as you can. All the way, all the way, all the way. and then out, all the way, all the way, all the way. Right? That's usually 3 liters or more. And that's called your vital capacity. That's the total amount of air you can move in and out of your lungs, okay? So think of it, vital capacity, right? It's your capacity, like when it's life-threatening, when it's vital. When you really need to move a lot of air in and out, this is how much you can move. So there's going to be a problem in your lab for this week where you use some data from spirometry to calculate some of these volumes. So obviously you can see here that vital capacity equals this plus this plus this, right? It equals all 3 things added together. This becomes important because in spirometry, most of the time, at least in the olden days before it was digital, we could only measure how much air people were blowing out. We couldn't measure how much people were inhaling in. So what that meant was we could measure vital capacity, right? How much they could blow out after filling their lungs up maximally. We could measure a typical tidal volume exhalation, and we could measure expiratory reserve volume, because these are all blowing out. But we can't measure that directly. So that's why you just need to do a little bit of math, okay, to deduce that one. All right. There is another lung volume. So we cannot fully deflate our lungs for 2 reasons. One is we have that membrane that's surrounding the outsides of the lungs and the inside of the rib cage that keeps them stuck to each other but able to slide past each other. So that membrane, you might remember, is called the pleura. Okay? So we can't have our lungs totally scrunched down inside of our rib cage, not normally, right, because of the pleura. We also don't want that to happen because the alveoli, those air sacs, are moist. Right? What happens if I take 2 wet things and I put them together? They stick, right? So I don't want my lungs to be able to fully deflate because then they'll all be stuck together, all those little alveolar sacs, and it'll be really hard to get them to open fully again, right? So I'm always going to have a little bit of air, actually a decent amount of air, because we have to still fill the rib cage with the lungs, called residual volume. This is air that you cannot exhale. It's always there, right? It's kind of dead space. I think of it like the peanut butter that you can't get out of the jar, right? So it's what's left over. You can't get rid of it. It's always going to be in there. Helps keep our lungs expanded to keep filling the thorax and so that they don't collapse. So those are our spirometry volumes, right? So a lot of times when someone is having lung problems for a variety of reasons, including COVID, but also asthma and emphysema or COPD, which is what people who are long-term smokers develop, we'll do a spirometry to measure some of these things and see what's going on with their actual lung capacity. So here's an example. Now what we're looking at here is a little bit different than what we've been talking about. What we're looking at is over time, so we're asking these people to blow out, right? So we're going to have them take in a huge breath and then blow out as hard and fast as they can. So in this particular test, we're not just measuring volume, well, we're also measuring speed with which they can move the air. So in someone whose lungs are behaving normally, they can move a lot of air out really quickly, okay? And so their total amount of air, this is forced vital capacity, so it's just vital capacity, that they can move out is quite high. Now someone with asthma, as you'll remember, their smooth muscle around their bronchi tends to constrict and spasm and make those air tubes smaller. So because the air tubes are smaller, it takes longer to be able to blow the air out. So what we see in people with asthma, the classic pattern, is that they can end up getting the air out. It's just slower, right? They can't get it out as quickly. They can't get as much out in as short a time, right? It takes them longer to fully empty their lungs. And then someone with COPD or emphysema from lifelong smoking, not only do they have a hard time getting the air out quickly, but they also have a significantly reduced vital capacity. And the thing that's interesting that happens with long-term smoking is the reason why their ability of their lungs to hold a certain volume of air is decreased is because they actually have something called air trapping. So a lot of their alveoli end up closing off, and they have these little blebs and bubbles of air just sitting in their lungs. So their residual volume actually goes up, which means their vital capacity, their functional amount of air that they can move, goes down. So if you've ever known somebody who has COPD, if it's really bad, we don't want them to go flying on airplanes because you have all these air bubbles trapped in the lung, basically, these collapsed alveoli that are walled off with big pockets of air in them. And when you go up in the atmosphere, right, and air pressure goes down, right, you know how your potato chip bags on the airplane are like, right? The same thing will happen. And that can cause them problems, actually. So if it's really severe, we don't want them to go flying in an airplane. All right, questions about spirometry? Yeah.
Since you did mention that COPD doesn't really last much longer, mostly because of long-term smoke, how does it also affect people who are surrounded by secondhand smoke?
So COPD itself is less common because of secondhand smoke, right? So secondhand smoke can increase your risk for asthma and some other lung problems, and it can be associated with an increased risk of lung cancer and other cancers because of the carcinogens present in smoke. But we usually, unless you're living with a 2-pack a day smoker, we usually don't see COPD just from secondhand smoke, unless it's a lot of exposure. Yeah, good question. Other questions? All right. So, how do we control respiration? How does breathing actually happen? So, is breathing voluntary or involuntary? Is it conscious or is it unconscious? So, if you think that breathing is voluntary and conscious, raise your hands. If you think that it's involuntary and unconscious, raise your hands. And of course, the answer is it's both, right? Because I can go if I want, right? I can also go for a while if I want, right? So I do have some voluntary control over my breathing, but most of my breathing most of the time is unconscious involuntary, right? And so one of the tricky things is when we learned about muscle tissue, we learned that smooth muscle is involuntary and skeletal muscle is voluntary. Well, it just so happens that the diaphragm is skeletal muscle. That's why we do have voluntary control over it. The involuntary unconscious control of the diaphragm is going to actually come not from the muscle itself, like with other smooth muscles, but from a part of the brain. So control of respiration is all coming from our central nervous system, from our brain. None of it is coming from the diaphragm muscle itself. We have involuntary control by the brain stem, which is the most inferior part of the brain hair before it turns into the spinal cord. Particularly a part of the brain stem called the medulla oblongata. And I just love that word. You could like sing a song, medulla oblongata, right? So I also love medulla oblongata because this is what keeps me alive. This is what breathes for me, so that thank goodness I don't have to think about it. Thank goodness I can sleep and not worry about having to I have to make myself breathe. So that's good. So the involuntary unconscious control is going to be by the medulla oblongata here in the brain stem. And the brain stem is responsible in general for basic life support. Okay, just keeping you alive. The higher centers in the brain are the kind of the more interesting things, right? So my voluntary control of breathing, when I intentionally do things with my breathing, those are higher regions of the brain that we'll talk about later when we do the nervous system. So today we're going to focus in on that unconscious or involuntary, that automatic control of breathing. So how do you think that the medulla oblongata can know when we are supposed to breathe? What does it use as a piece of data, as information, as a factor to decide when we need to take another breath? What do you think? Ideas? Yeah. It's going to use electrical impulses to send the signal to the diaphragm to breathe. That is true. What's it going to look at to know whether we need to breathe right now and whether I need to breathe quickly or whether I don't need to breathe quite so quickly? So that's a really good idea. What about levels of oxygen in the blood, right? Is that what my brainstem is monitoring and paying attention to? Well, it turns out that for most of us, most of the time, this is not what is regulating our breathing. Because if you remember from like high school, when you learned about the composition of air, right, it's like 80%, or I don't know, 78% nitrogen, and then it's 21% oxygen. The air that I exhale is 14% oxygen. I'm not using it all, right? So there's no way that my oxygen levels are falling appreciably at all in between breaths. And in fact, that's why rescue breathing, mouth to mouth, that's why that works, right? If the air I was exhaling had no oxygen in it anymore, what would I be doing for that poor person, right? So most of the time it's not oxygen. We also know that most of the time it's not oxygen, because if I put an oxygen mask on you and I give you 100% oxygen through that mask, right? So all the air that you're breathing in is just all oxygen. Your respiratory rate, the number of times you breathe per minute, will not slow down, right? You think, oh, now I only need to breathe twice a minute. No, you'd still breathe about 6 to 10 times per minute. Okay, so we know it's not oxygen that is controlling breathing the vast majority of the time. Now, I keep saying for most of us, most of the time. There are times when it is. This is my grandma. This is my grandma, that's me. And she smoked a lot. Like a lot. She smoked a lot. I love my grandma. She smoked a lot. To the point where towards the end of her life, she was on oxygen at home. She did die from COPD. And, you know, she would have the oxygen tank in the other room and then a big long tube coming to her sitting at the kitchen table, and she would sit there and smoke her cigarettes. Right? Really addictive. Right, yeah, I know, risk for explosions and all that kind of stuff. But, you know, the addiction is strong. So, but she also made the best chocolate chip cookies ever. She was a wonderful woman. In people who have advanced lung disease or in people who are sick with a pneumonia, then their oxygen levels are falling, right? Then oxygen is part of the drive to breathe. But for most of us, most of the time, oxygen is not what's driving our respiratory rate or the number of times we breathe per minute. So what is then? Carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is actually the master behind the signal to breathe. The reason is this. Remember how we learned about how the mitochondria make ATP, right? They're going to take glucose and they're going to turn it into ATP. Here's my glucose. This is that whole process. I want to draw your attention to this here. I think I have an animation here. Oh yeah, where does carbon dioxide come from? It is generated as a waste product from when the mitochondria produce ATP. So we are constantly inside of our cells producing carbon dioxide, constantly. And that is a problem for us. All right. Not only is carbon dioxide generated as a waste product from this process of making ATP, but we also need oxygen as an input. This is the formula of what we do. So we need glucose and oxygen, and we make ATP with waste products of carbon dioxide and actually water. We produce our own water. Kind of crazy, but we need so much that we also need to drink it. So oxygen comes in and carbon dioxide comes out. So this process happening in the cells, this series of chemical reactions by which we take glucose, add oxygen, end up making ATP and carbon dioxide as a waste product, is called cellular respiration. So you'd be like, oh, respiration has to do with breathing. Well, oxygen is going in, carbon dioxide is coming out. So that's why they named it that. So this process of cellular respiration is producing carbon dioxide as a waste product constantly in your body, every single moment of every single day, right? You are generating a substantial amount of carbon dioxide. All right? This is the entire reason that we breathe. This is the entire reason that you take air in and blow air out, is to get oxygen into your body for the cells to use for cellular respiration to make ATP, and to get carbon dioxide, which is building up as a waste product, out of your body. If we didn't do cellular respiration, we would not need to breathe. Right? This is all that it's for. This is it. Which is I think it's kind of cool and kind of crazy and weird. Right? This is the whole reason we breathe. Well, and so we can talk and sing, right? It's nice to be able to force air past your vocal cords and make noises. But other than that, all right. So the thing about carbon dioxide is it's a gas, right? So if I carried it in my bloodstream as a gas, then if I jumped around, I would get fizzy. That would be a problem. So we don't carry it in our blood as a gas. Instead, all right, so it's this waste product from cellular respiration. We're going to turn it into, we're going to combine it with water in the plasma of our blood and turn it into carbonic acid. We can also then turn that into bicarbonate ion and hydrogen ions, right? We can do this back and forth. But so in our bloodstream, for the most part, it's carried around as carbonic acid and bicarbonate ion and hydrogen ions. So this makes carbon dioxide acidic. This is what the problem is. This is why we need to get rid of it. We can only have so much acid in our bloodstream because regulation of pH is super duper important. So because carbon dioxide is acidic, because we turn it into carbonic acid, if it builds up in our blood or our bodies, our blood becomes more acidic and our blood pH is going to go down. So in between every single breath that you take, your blood pH goes down slightly. Because as you're waiting to do the next breath, specifically the next exhalation to get rid of carbon dioxide is starting to accumulate. Makes your pH go down. Now, how does the medulla oblongata know this? Part of the medulla oblongata can tell. It has some sensors, but it also has some additional informants. These are called chemoreceptors. So a receptor is a cell that's going to sense something and give you a signal about what's going on. Right? Chemo means chemical. And so chemoreceptors are specifically measuring blood pH. We have some located in this first part of the aorta, and we have some up here in our carotid arteries that are coming up to our head, right? So we have these chemoreceptors in really important places so that we can see exactly what's going on with our blood. There are some in the medulla oblongata itself, and then we have ones in the aorta and the carotid arteries. So they're measuring the pH, and then they're going to send a signal up to the brainstem, to the medulla oblongata, and send that information. Say, oh, pH is getting a little too low again. It's getting a little too acidic in here. And as soon as the medulla oblongata gets that piece of information, it's going to say, oh, we better breathe again. Right? So signals from the chemoreceptors come up to the medulla oblongata, which then sends a signal down to the diaphragm, and sometimes the intercostal muscles as well. Okay, we need to breathe. It's pretty cool. All right, there we go. And then we breathe. This is constantly happening, right? So like 6 to 10 times a minute when you're totally like chilling and not doing anything, right? I'm breathing faster than that because I'm moving around and I'm talking and all kinds of stuff, right? If you're really excited about something or if you're working hard, even cognitively working hard, you'll breathe faster. Obviously, if you're exercising, you're using lots of ATP. Muscle contractions require a lot of ATP. And so you're generating a lot of extra carbon dioxide, and you will need to breathe not only more rapidly, but also more deeply, right? So that's when you're working out really hard, you're doing an aerobic workout, and you can't really slow that down. I mean, you can try, but you won't be successful for long. Do different parts of the body require different amounts of ATP to move? If you're moving a big part of your body, that's going to take more force. So that's going to take more ATP versus a little part. So yeah. It all depends on how much work you're doing. And interestingly, even if you're just doing a lot of cognitive work, your brain needs more ATP when you're doing more cognitive work than when you're just, watching Netflix. Okay. All right. So let's hold our breaths and see how we feel. So take a big breath and hold it. And put your arm up and hold your arm up as long as you're holding your breath. All right, see, I have a disadvantage. I'm walking around up here. Okay, not a highly motivated group, but we've still got somebody going. Good job. How do you feel? We have a couple still going. You can relax now. How does it feel when you've been holding your breath for a long time? You might get a little lightheaded. Do you ever get kind of weird tingly? Right? Does it feel really uncomfortable? Right? Obviously, because eventually you have to do what? What's the first thing you do when you give up in a breath holding contest? You exhale. Absolutely. That is the first thing you do. In fact, if you need to make it last a little bit longer in the pool with your buddy, you're going to blow some air out. Why? Because the main determinant of breathing is carbon dioxide. And if you exhale, you get rid of some carbon dioxide. You buy yourself a few more seconds. Pretty cool. Now you know the secret. So is it actually better to breathe out before you hold your breath? No, because you also, well, I don't know. Now I don't know. It is better to hyperventilate before you hold your breath, right? So if you really want to win a breath holding contest, what you do first is you breathe really deeply and rapidly, like several times. That blows off a lot of carbon dioxide. Now if you do that, you will start to feel lightheaded as you're doing that. And the reason is you're getting rid of too much carbon dioxide and your blood pH starts going up. So this is why sometimes if somebody's hyperventilating, either because they're in labor, right, or because they're anxious about something, they can get tingling in their fingers and around the mouth because their blood pH is actually going too high now because they're getting rid of too much carbon dioxide. But if you want to hold your breath for really long, hyperventilate beforehand. Then you start off with your blood pH a little high, you have farther to go before you have to take another breath. Questions? All right. So this is all about gas exchange, right? Bringing oxygen in and getting carbon dioxide out. It's like, I'll trade you oxygen for carbon dioxide. So we're going to look a little bit more closely at the mechanics of gas exchange itself. So the whole purpose of this whole thing, the reason why we have lungs, is to bring in oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide, because we need oxygen to make ATP, and we generate carbon dioxide as a waste product of producing ATP. Neither gas, not oxygen, not carbon dioxide, travels freely in the blood. So we have special systems for dealing with each of these so that we don't have fizzy blood. I mean, it kind of sounds a little fun, but it really would not be. All right, so carbon dioxide, we've already talked about this one in explaining why it's acidic, right? So it comes from cellular respiration. I keep repeating that. Maybe it's important, right? I keep repeating that. And it gets transported not as free gas, but as carbonic acid and bicarbonate ion. Now, so not only are we going to take the carbon dioxide that's produced in the mitochondria in our cells and move it into the bloodstream and quickly turn it into carbonic acid and bicarbonate ion, but then we're also going to want to be able to quickly turn it back into gas to go into our lungs, into our alveoli, so we can breathe it out. So anytime we need to do a chemical reaction really quickly, we're going to speed it up by having an enzyme that allows us to do it really quickly and easily. Enzymes are proteins. They are specific to that specific reaction, and the one we use for this one is called carbonic anhydrase. Okay, so carbonic anhydrase is a really important enzyme that we have in our blood so that we can quickly move carbon dioxide gas into carbonic acid and bicarbonate ion, and then on the other side, quickly move things back the other way. This is a reversible equation, right? This is a reversible chemical reaction, and carbonic anhydrase will help us go each way. Yeah?
So I know that earlier it was mentioned that some people are born without like the lactase enzyme.
Mm-hmm.
Are there people who get born without vital enzymes like carbonic?
Right. So if you don't have carbonic anhydrase enzyme, you cannot live.
Okay.
Yeah. So there is no such thing as a living human that doesn't have this enzyme. It's that important. Good question. All right. What about oxygen? So oxygen is different, right? We remember from when we learned about blood and red blood cells or erythrocytes that they are sacs of hemoglobin. That protein, so it's this protein molecule that will bind oxygen reversibly, which is really important. It needs to be able to grab onto oxygen, and then it also needs to be able to let go of oxygen, right? Like when we get to the cells and we want to deliver it to them. So oxygen is handled differently than carbon dioxide because we have this special molecule just for it. So oxygen is attached to hemoglobin inside our red blood cells, which you'll remember are specially designed cells that are really just sacs of hemoglobin. They don't even have a nucleus anymore. They've sacrificed themselves just to be oxygen carriers. All right. So in the tissues then, these are my body tissues. It could be a muscle. It could be a hair follicle, right? It could be my stomach glands, right? So anywhere in the body that you have tissues, which is everywhere, it could be my bone cells, right? I need oxygen, and I'm creating carbon dioxide as a waste product inside my cells for cellular respiration. So because of that, the blood that's coming to my tissues, when it's coming from the arteries through the arterioles to the capillaries, it's high in oxygen, right? So the concentration of oxygen is going to be higher in the blood and lower in the body tissues because my cells are using it up. So what's that process called when a solute moves from an area where it's highly concentrated to an area of low concentration? That is called diffusion. Yes, thank you, right? So oxygen is going to diffuse passively. This requires no energy. Thank goodness. Gosh, we would waste a lot of energy if we had to move it actively. Thank goodness, right? Oxygen is at really high concentration here in the capillary blood. It's at low concentration in the cells of my tissues because I've been using it up in my mitochondria to make ATP. So oxygen will freely and quickly move off of the hemoglobin, out of the capillary that has just that one skinny cell thick wall, right? That simple squamous epithelium, and out into the body cells, okay? Carbon dioxide is being produced inside my cells, so it's in a high concentration here and a low concentration there. So it's going to move the opposite way. So out in the body tissues, carbon dioxide is going to move from the cells into the bloodstream. Perfect. This is just another picture, and it's really low res, but I kind of liked it anyway, right? So oxygen is moving into the cells, right? That's a better picture than my little square. And then carbon dioxide is moving out of the cells and into the blood. All right. So now we have this used up blood. It's low in oxygen and high in carbon dioxide, which was the piece we didn't really talk about before. So now it's going to travel through the veins of my body, right? And the veins of my body carrying the deoxygenated blood are going to end up where? Where does that blood go? To the heart? To which side of the heart? The right side of the heart, okay? So I'm going to go either through the superior vena cava or the inferior vena cava into the right atrium. Remember, the atrium is the receiving area of the heart. Into the right atrium. Then I'm going to go the atria, the P wave, right? The SA node is going to signal the atria. I'm going to move down into the right ventricle. And then after the AV node waits for it, it's going to send a signal down the AV bundle, left and right bundle branches, and the Purkinje fibers in the right ventricle is going to go whomp, right? And then the ventricles are going to contract. Can't go backwards because of the tricuspid valve, so I'm going to shoot out through the pulmonary trunk into the pulmonary arteries. So here I go, deoxygenated blood out the pulmonary arteries to all the different parts of the lungs, and eventually to pulmonary capillaries. Okay, so here I come, I'm oxygen depleted blood. Now remember, the pulmonary arteries are blue because it's deoxygenated blood. They're only called arteries because they're carrying blood away from the heart. But since it's away from the right side of the heart, it's blue, right? So here I come, and now I'm going to have a network of capillaries that are surrounding those alveoli, those air sacs. So now I'm going to have this oxygen poor, carbon dioxide rich blood coming in. The wall of the capillary is just one simple squamous cell thick. The wall of the alveolus is just one simple squamous epithelial cell thick. Really easy then for diffusion to occur here in the lungs between the pulmonary capillaries and the alveoli, right? So again, blue blood coming in, right? This network covers the surface of the alveolus. Carbon dioxide is going to diffuse out into the air inside the alveolus because that air is low in carbon dioxide. And oxygen is going to move from the alveolus into the blood. How much carbon dioxide is there in air? Right, well now it's like 417 parts per million, right? It used to be 300. Yay, industrialization, right? But, right, that's parts per million, right? Oxygen is 21%, right? So there's very, very little carbon dioxide in the air, relatively speaking, right, compared to other gases. So this diffusion of carbon dioxide out is really, really fast, right? Because the concentration here is way higher than the concentration out there. So this moves in really fast. Oxygen, there's a lot of it in the air, right? 21%. There's practically none of it by the time the blood is getting here to the pulmonary capillaries, so it's going to very quickly move in. Now, obviously, the carbon dioxide was not being carried as a free gas. What was it being carried as in the blood? Yeah, carbonic acid and bicarbonate ions. So what's the enzyme that I need in order to turn it back into a gas and let it float out into the air? Carbonic anhydrase, right? So I'm going to use my carbonic anhydrase right here. Oxygen, as long as you got hemoglobin, you're good. Okay? A little different there. So this is what the lungs are all about. So, when we talked about pneumonias, regardless of whether it's a bacterial pneumonia or a COVID-associated pneumonia or a severe ARDS situation, anytime you have fluid or pus building up in these air sacs, then that's less surface area, less space for air, right? And that's going to impair gas exchange. So that's why we check people's oxygen levels. Sometimes we check people's carbon dioxide levels too, but because the partial pressures of carbon dioxide are so vastly different, because there's so little of it in like regular air, carbon dioxide is almost never high, right? That's not usually a problem, except in people with COPD. They are very different animals. But so that's why we're focused a lot on people's oxygen levels. Are they able to get enough in? All right, so now we have this newly oxygenated blood in the pulmonary capillaries, and it has to get back to the heart. So by definition, I'm traveling back through to the heart. I'm traveling through a vein. So I'm red because I'm now oxygenated because I'm fresh from the lungs. So my pulmonary veins are red, carrying oxygenated blood from the lungs to the heart. Now we're going to enter the left side of the heart, come into the left atrium. Again, on the next beat, SA node sends its signal. We get the wah, right? The blood from the left atrium moves into the left ventricle. AV node, AV bundle, right and left bundle Purkinje fibers. Whomp! Left ventricle contracts, pushes this beautifully oxygenated blood out into the aorta, the main artery of the body. Oh, there we go. So left atrium, left ventricle, out the aorta, and out into all the other branching arteries that are going to go to all the different parts of our bodies, and then into the smaller and smaller arteries, and eventually the little arterioles, and then into the capillaries, and then look, we're right back where we started. So this is happening constantly. This is the whole reason, well, this is half of the reason why you have a circulatory system, is for gas exchange, right? The other reason is for nutrient delivery, right? That glucose, as well as other building blocks for cells, like amino acids and things like that. Questions about this? Yeah? Oh. Yeah, so the question is, if you get a blood transfusion, right, is that blood oxygenated or not? And it's not, interestingly, right? So if you've ever seen blood hanging, somebody getting a blood transfusion, it's not bright red. It's kind of a dark maroon color because it's so cool. So when you donate blood, first of all, they take blood from a artery or vein? Vein. They take blood from a vein for a couple of reasons. One is then you're not going psh, 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 right? It's not a high pressure system, so like that's good. It's like you're not going to bleed so much, all right? The other is veins tend to be much more superficial in our body, right? So if you look at the inside of your elbow, you can see your veins. You can't see your arteries. Smart design, right? Higher pressure system, we're going to keep those deeper in our body, right? Arteries are only close to the surface in those places where you can feel a pulse, right? And there are a few of them, but in general, we want to protect those. So they're going to draw blood from a vein, so it's relatively deoxygenated to start. Then they mix it with a compound that kind of helps like pause the red blood cells so that they don't die, right? Because then when they collect your blood, they're not oxygenating it for you at all, right? And then they put it in a refrigerator to cool it down, right? So it'll last longer without dying, just like your produce from the store. Same thing, just slow down its metabolism so it can last longer. So the good thing is that as long as you don't have terrible lung disease, getting a blood transfusion is no big deal. There's more than enough oxygen coming into your lungs. So if there's more red blood cells around to pick it up, perfect. No problem. Good question. Other questions?
What if the blood is infected with HIV?
Right, so what if the blood is infected with HIV or other potential infections, right? So HIV is an infection that's spread through the bloodstream. And in fact, in the early days of HIV, which is human immunodeficiency virus, which is the virus that causes AIDS, or acquired immune deficiency syndrome, right? So we do that where we have a different name for the virus and the disease it causes. So we have HIV and AIDS. We have SARS-CoV-2 and COVID, right? So we have varicella and chickenpox. Right? So back when HIV first started, we didn't know what it was. We just knew that there were all of these young men dying from really weird infections. And we had no idea why. And we didn't know it was something that was in the bloodstream. And so, in fact, in the early 80s, some of the blood supply through the Red Cross and other organizations was actually contaminated with HIV. And some people did get HIV infections from receiving a blood transfusion. So there was one young boy named Brian White. Yeah. And it was really heartbreaking because at the time we had no treatments for HIV. We now have really good treatments. We had none then. And there was also a lot of fear and stigma. So if somebody was HIV positive back then, the school board didn't want him to go to school there. Kids wouldn't play with him. Nobody would hug him or touch him or anything, despite the fact that this virus is actually quite difficult to transmit. You have to share needles or a blood transfusion or have sex with somebody to transmit HIV. But we didn't know that then. So it was really heartbreaking. But nowadays, blood is screened for HIV. Okay? And for COVID, actually. So if you want to know if you perhaps have already had COVID, the Red Cross, as an incentive to get people to donate blood right now, they'll do an antibody test to see if you have antibodies against COVID, which, as you now know, you will only have antibodies against COVID if your immune system has seen the virus and created them, or you receive the experimental infusion of antibodies, like our president, right? So you would only have antibodies in your system if your immune system has seen COVID and attacked it. The absence of antibodies doesn't mean you haven't had COVID, because not everybody creates antibodies against it. But it also doesn't tell you when you had it. It takes several weeks to make antibodies against something sometimes, so it doesn't tell you when you had it. You could have had it 6 months ago, you could have had it a month ago, or a week ago. Good. Other questions? All right, let's do a Kahoot. Go ahead and get your phones out. On one more thing. So you've probably heard of carbon monoxide poisoning, right? We live in a part of the world where sometimes people have indoor space heaters or indoor wood-fired stove, things that perhaps aren't always vented the way they should be. And so carbon monoxide can build up, especially if you're running a generator indoors. Carbon monoxide is often produced. Now, so we have to be careful. This is carbon monoxide, not carbon dioxide. So this is a carbon molecule bonded to a single oxygen. So this is a completely different animal than carbon dioxide. So carbon monoxide is a clear, odorless gas, right? It's produced by car engines as well, so sometimes that's where we see it. And the thing about this gas is it attaches super strongly to hemoglobin, way more strongly than oxygen, and it doesn't let go. So what happens then is you lose your ability for your blood to transport oxygen. So you end up actually having symptoms of low oxygen. So because your tissues aren't getting enough oxygen, you can't make enough ATP, so you get headaches, you can feel dizzy, you can feel weak, right? And if it gets really bad, right, you can feel short of breath. If it gets really bad, you can faint and you can even die from carbon monoxide poisoning. And here in our state, this happens to not zero, right? It happens to several people per year. And it's tough because you can't smell it, you can't see it, right? But the reason why it's so dangerous is it binds to hemoglobin and then therefore oxygen can't bind to hemoglobin. And the tricky thing about it too is when it binds to hemoglobin, it turns hemoglobin bright red. So these people look really pink. They look like they're getting lots of oxygen. They look like their blood is really well oxygenated, but it's not. It has carbon monoxide on it instead of oxygen. So that's what carbon monoxide poisoning is.
So carbon monoxide then does not like to let go of the hemoglobin.
Yep.
For getting treated for carbon monoxide poisoning, how does that work? Do they have to take blood out or give you?
Yeah, so if somebody has severe carbon monoxide poisoning, the only way to treat that is to take some of their blood out and give them a blood transfusion of blood that doesn't have its hemoglobin hijacked by carbon monoxide.
So the only time where like bloodletting would actually work.
Yes, bloodletting would work for that particular problem, as long as you then give them a transfusion back. Now, most cases are relatively mild, and thank goodness we constantly are making new red blood cells, right? Because they only live 90 days. We're constantly making new ones all the time. So a lot of times you can just support somebody by giving them a little bit of extra oxygen, for a few hours to days. And just as their body is continually making new red blood cells, those red blood cells are free from this contamination, so to speak. So a lot of times we don't need to do anything more invasive. So really quickly, I'm just going to kind of do a review of most of what we talked about today. So if we think about it from when carbon dioxide is first born, right? So it's first created in the mitochondria as a waste product of cellular respiration, right? And so it moves out into the cell, and then it's going to move from the cell into the bloodstream. We're going to use carbonic anhydrase to turn it into carbonic acid and bicarbonate ion. Oh, there it goes. Then it's going to move from the tissue capillaries into the venules and the veins, and then move up into bigger and bigger veins, right? Here it comes. Eventually draining through either the inferior or superior vena cava into the right atrium, down into the right ventricle, and then it's going to get pumped out from the right ventricle into the pulmonary arteries and out into the lungs. Pulmonary arteries are blue because it's deoxygenated blood. Into the pulmonary capillaries surrounding the alveoli, where then it is going to move out into the air in the alveoli with the help of carbonic anhydrase, which is going to turn it back into a gas, right? So that we can release it into the air, and then we're going to breathe it out. So it's going to go from the alveolus through the bronchioles into the bronchi, then up through the trachea, and then it's free, right? And then it's gone. So, yeah, we're not doing that.